Welcome to the Tech Tides Africa podcast. We discuss stories around the world of technology and startups in Africa. I'm Kelvin, speaking from Nigeria, and with me is Karen. Karen, how you doing?
Hi, Kelvin. I'm excited to be here. I'm seeing we have some really cool topics to discuss today. So, coming in from Nakuru, Kenya, I'm really happy to be here.
So today we will be talking about newly minted stablecoins in Nigeria and Kenya. We will touch on startups that have shut down. We'll also talk a bit about electric vehicles and Max's goal to push that in Africa. So, starting with stablecoins, what's your experience with cryptocurrencies in general, Karen? Have you traded them before? Have you bought or invested? What's your experience like?
I am so old school when it comes to money.
I
I
see.
have a deep distrust for crypto, and I
Ah,
am still waiting to see if I can get trust for it. Obviously, we're seeing governments trying to get a hold of it by bringing in a lot of legal frameworks. So that might build trust for me. My brother does a lot of crypto. He trades crypto, and I've seen him lose money in seconds. So
yeah.
it's for me. I'm the old school. I do believe that it is the future, but I am still quite on the fence when it comes to adopting it. What about you? Do you use crypto? Is it something that you've used because you're deep in tech?
Yeah, I'm deep in tech, but I am also, let's say I'm very conservative when it comes to life in general. So I have traded, a couple of cryptocurrencies every now and then. I'm not a crypto trader. I have never been. I don't think I will ever be. But is a technology that I'm very much interested in from a technological standpoint, really, since I'm a tech
Yeah.
person. So I've not traded a lot of cryptocurrencies, but I have built a mobile app with a team that was for
Mm.
crypto. And I have also worked on some NFT applications as well. That's
Yeah.
pretty much
Okay.
it.
But I do think that there's still a lot of education to be done on crypto because I'm quite tech savvy, if I do say so myself. But
Hmm.
I still have a very hard time fully understanding the concept of crypto, right? I think that's
Yeah.
a big problem with most people in Africa. It's still quite new for most of us, and I think there's still a lot of education that needs to be done in terms of understanding what it is, understanding how to track it, understanding how to not lose money, because I think that's the biggest fear, that your money can just disappear. Especially because we're used to like hard cash, For me, you'll never
Yeah.
miss cash in my purse. It feels so safe that I know where it is. Um,
Yeah.
so I think there's still a lot of education and regulations that need to come in place before people can fully trust it.
Yeah, that's true. I think we are still very much cash based and people trust cash a lot. I mean, cash in hand is always just more secure than any currency on your screen. But then you talk about regulation, and that's interesting because our topics today have to do with some regulation with stable coins. So there are two things with cryptocurrency at the moment. There needs to be more education and then there needs to be regulation. So I think the
Hmm.
governments are still trying to understand what cryptocurrency is, first of all, before you now talk about regulation. So
Hmm.
stable coins are basically coins that are pegged to a particular currency. For example, we have USDT, which is pegged to the dollars. And now we have CNGN, which is the stablecoin that was launched in Nigeria, and it is pegged to the naira. The idea is
Hmm.
that one CNGN is equal to one naira. So instead of holding your hard cash, you can hold this digital cryptocurrency. This is the
Interesting.
base idea of stablecoins. Now,
Hmm.
Nigeria has an interesting past with cryptocurrency and continuously evolving past with cryptocurrency. First of all, there was a ban on crypto trading in 2021. It was misunderstood mainly. It wasn't a ban on crypto trading, it was a ban on financial institutions facilitating crypto trading. So you couldn't fund your crypto accounts directly from your bank, for example. So what happened was we saw a lot of these trading platforms move over to a peer-to-peer model where if Karen, you want one USDT and I want the Naira equivalent of that, these platforms will pair both of us together. You send the fiat and then I send you the crypto. And we moved with that model for a while. So we have gone from that, a lot of regulation, a lot of bans, some tussle with Binance, which is the biggest trading platform in the world, crypto trading platform in the world. And now Nigeria has launched its own stable coin, as well as the SEC is also giving out some licenses for two locally made crypto trading platforms, Quidax and Busha, and has added them to its regulatory incubation program. So I think there is some effort on the part of the Nigerian government to understand cryptocurrency, not just flat out push it out. And then now they are trying to create regulations around it.
I think that cuts across most countries because we've seen the same kind of history in Kenya, where it starts with the government being very wary and then now realizing that they have to bring it into the fold. And especially with Kenya, because as a country, digital currency is very mainstream because of M-Pesa, right? Most Kenyans just prefer doing this on a digital space. So cryptocurrency is kind of a natural transition for a lot of Kenyans, mainly because we're already used to money being digital. So I think we also saw that in the early 2010s, the central bank was against cryptocurrency. They actually issued a warning in 2015 to the public against using virtual currencies because they felt there's a lot of volatility, potential for fraud, and as I said last week on the podcast, a lot of illegal transactions because of obviously money laundering, which is a big problem in Africa, actually in the world. So being able to track money becomes even more difficult when it's crypto. But by 2022, 10% of Kenyans already owned some form of cryptocurrency. And Binance also being what it is, a lot of people were able to get onto that. But now we're seeing last year, a lot more acceptance from the government. They've created a task force in 2018 that was supposed to examine how these technologies work and how they can be used to improve financial services in the country. And last year, they drafted a policy on virtual asset service providers, and we're seeing a lot more licensing happening in fintech as well as in crypto in
Yeah.
Kenya. I think licensing is going to be something that's going to be big, ensuring that everyone who's dealing in crypto is licensed. So I think that's going to be the trend. And I usually feel like three countries inform trends in Africa, and that's Nigeria, Kenya, and South Africa. We kind of inform trends and how they work in Africa. And so I'm expecting to see the same kind of trend go through other countries.
Yeah, you're spot on. So once there is some regulation and more education about cryptocurrencies, would we now finally get you interested in cryptocurrencies?
I mean, like being someone who works online across borders, this is really interesting to me. If I can be sure that my money is safe, it's better than having to trade in dollars and in other currencies where there's a lot of fluctuations in value. Like the end of 2023, the beginning of 2024, the Kenya shilling was not performing that well. So the dollar was quite expensive. For us who are paid in dollars, we were celebrating out here, it was at 150 shillings. So if a client pays me $500, I was making insane money, whereas before it was 100 shillings. So there was a boom of 50 shillings on top. And then
Yeah.
all of a sudden it went down. And if you had made some lifestyle changes based
Yeah.
on this, it became an issue. So it's going to be a very big added value for people who are trading across borders, whether it's in terms of service or in terms of goods. And as we're trying to open up like the African cross trade, I think this will be a big plus for us. There's a bit more stability in my
Yeah,
view.
yeah,
Yeah. So I think if it can be stable, we'll see a lot of gig economy workers adopt it. We'll see a lot of cross border businesses adopt it. And I think it will create even more trade across continents.
that's good. In Nigeria, we also experienced that if you are paid in dollars, then it was good for you. But I think what also I noticed, and we have talked about over the last year in Nigeria, is the goods also increase prices, services also increase prices. So it kind of almost evens out when you're spending the money. For example, when you receive $1, the equivalent at the moment is 1,600 naira. When you go to the market to buy a bottle of Coke, the price today could be two times that price tomorrow. So in a way, it does even out, which is why there needs to be some stability, like you talked about. But we'll see how this new embrace of cryptocurrency plays out. So moving on, startup shutdowns. We saw one big startup shutdown earlier last week. We'll get into that. But before that, we will touch a bit on Zoto. So Zoto was a fintech startup based in Nigeria. They basically helped people to buy airtime through their platform. So the key thing is before 2010s, if you want to buy airtime, you buy a scratch card. Some people call it a recharge card, and there will be a pin on it. As we moved into the 2010s, we started seeing digital ways of getting these pins. Then, as the technology became better, you could just recharge directly without these pins to your line. So Zoto was one of the first adopters of this technology, and they had some success. They got up to 1 million users as they claimed they did, but they ran into some challenges that made them shut down in 2018. And we covered this in depth on the Startup Graveyard Africa blog. But the main story last week, I think, for a lot of Nigerians was on Bento shutdown. We talked about Bento before this podcast. I gave a bit of gist about Bento.
Yes. Yes. Give me the tea.
Just for our listeners, the summary is that for the last couple of weeks, it has been one thing or the other with Bento. So, first of all, it started with an allegation. A popular tech founder accused them of tax fraud and pension fraud. Once he made that known, other users of Bento came out with their own stories of Bento as well.
Yeah.
This went over to LinkedIn. Eventually, the founder responded. He said that there are some challenges they are dealing with. They have a small team. He tried to, I guess, answer everybody. That wasn't going out well. By the next day or 2 days later, they were being investigated for the allegations. By the next week, we heard that the CEO, founder, had stepped down. And then the very next day, they laid off their engineering team. About a week later, they said they had kept their essential team together to resolve the allegations and issues users were facing. And early last week, they said that they are officially shutting down operations in Nigeria. At least that was what I picked up in Nigeria. I don't know about the operations in other countries because they operate in Ghana as well and some other ones. But that is the general gist.
Yeah. I think, first of all, I usually feel for startups in Africa because there are very many challenges. Startups everywhere, but we're talking about Africa. And there's so many challenges with building and growing a business in Africa. First of all, we're so diverse in cultures, right?
Yeah.
So, like when you go to Nigeria, there are different cultures. The way you would approach perhaps an Igbo person is very different from the way you'd approach someone else. They're so diverse in terms of target market and keeping up with that target market, number one. Number two, our regulations are so restrictive and then constantly changing.
Yeah.
Keeping up with that is so difficult. Getting financing is also quite a hard task in Africa. I think just being African or starting the startup in Africa puts you at a bit of a disadvantage. We actually have a founder here in Kenya called Tony Ndongo, and he says he starts all his businesses and registers them in the US. The aim is to build services in Africa, but he builds them in the US because access to funding becomes so much easier with them being US based companies. So that's a big challenge as well. And I think that's part of why we're seeing so many businesses, including Zoto, shutting down. It's these challenges that become quite difficult to surmount, adding to the fact that the training and exposure to the mentorship and knowledge that founders require is very limited. So I feel for that in terms of growing a startup in Africa and seeing the number of case studies that we create on Startup Graveyard that show startups that had very good promise, startups that had very good solutions, but were not able to be sustainable and scalable across the continent. So that would be what I would say in terms of Zoto. Now, in terms of Bento, that's a whole different story because I've seen they've said it's a temporary closure, but then you wonder how much customer loyalty and trust have they lost, and will they be able to gain it back? Will the market ever trust them again?
That's the challenge, right? And we have seen it before. It's not the first temporary shutdown that has just not come back again. I don't know if they would eventually come back. But for me, it's like when you have like a blown out issue like this, how do you regain trust? Is it possible to regain trust? I was trying to find instances of this happening, like just generally in history, where there has been like a large backlash from customers. There has been a big distrust like this, and somehow the company turned it around. Hasn't
Hmm.
really happened. I couldn't find any, maybe because of time, but it's just hard, right? And then, I mean, there are other competitors in the market that would fill that gap. So by the time you resolve these issues, the market has kind of left. So it's hard being a founder in Africa with all of the regulation, and it's not just the regulation. Is as you're entering new markets, there is a different regulation in these markets as well. So something that works
Yeah.
in these other markets doesn't necessarily like apply in this market. It may even be illegal in this market. So trying
Hmm.
to keep up with all of that is hard. But
Yeah.
on the other side of that, which is why these founders still build, is the opportunity. Africa is still
Yeah.
full of opportunities. So you just need to find a way to tap into those opportunities. We have seen some successful startups, right, in Africa. So definitely, you just need to tap into that.
Yeah, absolutely. But I also think that when we see stories like what Bento is going through, and even Zoto, because the closure of Zoto was not clean cut, right? People lost their funds. They were not clear with their communication in terms of their closure. It's still not clear whether they've closed or not because their website is operational. And
Yeah,
the problem is it builds distrust in the community where the next founder who comes up with such a business has even more work to do to build trust because previous people have broken that trust. And I think that makes it even more difficult for the next founders. So it's definitely something to look out for to see will other HR organizations like maybe Seamless HR will they gain the market share that Bento had, and hopefully the manner in which regulations are done will be tighter for fintechs, but also the education of those regulations to the founders will be better.
Yeah,
and just to see how the coming startups will struggle with building sustainability and trust amongst their clients as a result of what happened with these two startups.
definitely.
Anyway, with that being said, we can go to Max. We can talk about electric vehicles and the massive layoffs that we saw with Max a few, I think it was last week, I'm not sure. The Metro Africa Express, which is a Nigeria mobility financing startup, and it has laid off about 150 members of staff, which is 30% of its workforce in January. And they are making a strategic shift to exclusively work with financing electric vehicles in Nigeria, in Ghana, and in Cameroon. So they're tripling the number of vehicles that they financed last year, but they have done major layoffs to try and save on costs. Now, one of the things I picked up from this story, and I'm looking forward to hearing your perspective, Kevin, is the manner in which they did the layoffs. So I was reading part of what was on Tech Cabal, and one of the employees actually states that he didn't even know he was being laid off as part of a massive layoff exercise, because the manner in which they were laid off was in terms of appraisals. So appraisals were done and staff were laid off. And I think this is something that we're seeing a lot in the employment sector across the continent, where the manner in which employers are treating employees, African employees, is very unfair, if I can say, because these people were removed from employment and were not given their packages, which should be your right if there's a massive layoff with a company. Instead, they brought up appraisal and performance issues and fired people. It kind of makes me wonder about the future of work in Africa, because understanding our rights as employees is important, and being treated fairly is also important. So that's one thing that I pick up from this story. But I also see the transition to electric vehicles, which is an exciting thing, because that's the future of green energy in Africa. And I'm interested to hear what are your thoughts on the whole thing, either on the electrical vehicles or on employee relations.
So employee relations, first of all, there are two sides of the story, like you mentioned. First is the layoffs, and then second is the EV, electronic vehicles. So starting with the employees, I think it's really important to talk about how we handle these things. Generally, we have an issue in Africa where a lot of employees complain about the way their employers treat them. Being an employee goes beyond just receiving salary and providing some value or the other. There are other things involved, the way your employer communicates to you, the way your employer handles appraisals and things like that. It's very important. And in the case of Max, it seems some things they didn't do nicely. And imagine getting laid off, and they said it was because of an appraisal, but then you now see that there are a lot of other people that were laid off too.
Mhm.
So you start to ask, was it really because of an appraisal or because they were moving in another direction? And that's what Max does a lot. They tend to pivot a lot, and it's hard to talk about the story of Max.ng without talking about their pivots.
Mm.
Quark started as a logistics company, last mile delivery for different companies and organizations. And then they saw like a gap in the ride hailing space in Lagos. I don't know whether I've heard about Lagos traffic, but it's mental. So they started helping Lagosians to move faster within traffic because a bike is smaller than a car and can get to its destination a lot faster. So if there was no traffic, maybe this opportunity will not be there. But then again, because the government put some regulation in place that prevented motorcycles from moving within certain areas, they had to pivot, and then they have now ended in mobility solutions, vehicle financing, and things like that. So Max.ng is a startup that's not afraid to move. They are not afraid to change direction if they see this is not working. So I wonder what they see with electronic vehicles. Yes, it's the future, but Africa is still a bit behind in terms of green energy, this green energy revolution we are seeing. So I wonder what they see now that's making them to make this pivot at the cost of these layoffs at this point in time.
Wow, that's interesting. And I think they're also following a tech trend that we're seeing across Africa and also across the globe, where there are a lot of layoffs in tech. Over the last couple of years, there have been massive layoffs in tech. And I think one of the things is we're seeing a lot of founders prioritizing profitability and working with a lean team as opposed to workforce expansion. So
Yeah.
I think the future of work is very lean teams, and tech is trying to pioneer that where you're creating high profits with a very small team.
And this will only even like increase further with AI and AI
Yeah.
agents, right? I've seen like conversations online where people are talking about you have maybe just one founder and a couple of AI agent employees. And it seems
Yeah.
so wild to think about it now, but you can start to see some of that possibility because they are getting really good. A couple of years back, you would have been like, we are still far off, but these days
Yeah.
now, they are really good. You can see these tools building a full web application. And as a programmer myself, I'm like, wow, are they coming for my jobs as well? But yeah, I think we are going to see more leaner teams. It's unfortunate that this wasn't thought about from the beginning because at the end of the day, these are real people that are affected by these layoffs.
100%. And there's something else that you've said that has really interested me. The adoption of EV and green energy
Yeah.
mobility is still quite slow in Africa. And it begs the question, will there be policies that will help to subsidize the adoption of this new technology for Macs? Or will we see high costs slow down their growth plan? Because that's also something to look out for. How will the government policies support them to create adoption? Because when you're bringing in something new, your highest cost is in educating the public and getting adoption of the product. So are they going to see subsidies? Is the government going to support them? Will they maybe have tax relief that will help them? Or will high costs and slow adoption actually cause failure for them? So that will be something interesting to look out for.
Yeah. It will be very interesting to look out for that. I think it's easier when you're working with government than working against government or working over government. But then governments are kind of slow to move and startups are built for speed. So it's always a very contradicting collaboration. But there's definitely something that they have seen that has made them to make these bets at this point. And so we'll see how this plays out for them. That's all for this episode. Thank you for joining us. We'll be back next week with more stories from the world of startups and technologies in Africa. See you next week, Thursday, same time, same place. Bye.
Bye.